speakers are going to highlight the connections of SDO in this vast topic. We'll begin first with our plenary speaker, Patrick Antolin. He will talk about the delicate coronal mass limit. And Patrick, if you are ready, you can take it from here.
Yes, I'll start sharing now. Okay, so first I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to and be invited to give this talk and talk about this fantastic topic. This is of course a very, very challenging topic, like the mass and energy transfer across the solar atmosphere, because it's extremely broad, right? And so in this talk I would like to concentrate on particularly in the circulation of mass and energy across the solar atmosphere. That is to say, I like to concentrate on closed loop systems, such as the Coronal loops that we see in this movie. The results I'm going to talk about have are greatly have benefited a lot. The insight I have gained has benefited a lot from two EC teams in 2015, 2018. And in which we studied particularly this multi-scale variability that we see. I'll briefly discuss the constituents, the energy source, the heating mechanisms, but I will focus on the global observational signatures that have driven coronal heating and the numerical efforts for understanding this phenomenon. So these coronal loops, right? The name is a bit misleading, right? Because they're really there because of this very strong coupling across the solar atmosphere, and in particular, it's the chromosphere-corona coupling that defines them. So chromosphere should somehow be there in the whenever we mention coronal loops. And the mass and energy cycle is basically a synonym of coronal heating, right? So it's the coronal heating is the powering this cycle in the solar atmosphere, and the aim is to be able to understand what is variability that we observe in images such as those observed from SDO. So these coronal loops are, we understand that they're the basic constituents of the closed corona. They, with the chromosphere helping us as a mass reservoir, but not only. And they have specific sizes and a wide range of temperatures, right? And the morphology, it's one of the main aspects that we are aim to understand. So the energy source, first of all, is we all agree that that's on the substratospheric layers of the sun, but also on the global sources, like as P modes. We know now that they leak into the solar atmosphere and they're able to power, but we don't know how much actually the solar corona. So these local sources, the granular convection, magnetic buffeting, and so on, they occur on very specific spatial scales and time scales, and it's these scales that really define the way in which eventually the magnetic energy is going to be dissipated. So there we're talking about, of course, about MHD waves, or the steady buildup of magnetic stress that will be released through magnetic reconnection. And we have a very good idea of the amount of energy that is needed in order to power the active the corona in different regions of the sun. So two main groups have emerged through the decades. So one, of course, is these MHD waves, and the other one is this stress-induced magnetic reconnection. And each one is based on very different physical processes. So MHD waves can be incompressible, compressible, and therefore their dissipation mechanism can be very different, rely on a nonlinear instability, for example. Besides shocks, all MHD wave dissipation mechanisms really rely on the small scales, on the buildup of a turbulent cascade to the small scales where where dissipation can take place, and that's because of the very high magnetic Reynolds numbers in the solar atmosphere. On the other hand, the stress-induced magnetic reconnection relies on the amount of braiding that exists in coronal loops, but not only at the small scale of the coronal loop, but on a much wider scale as well. That's what we call flux tube tectonics. And then the hypothesis is that eventually reconnection must take place, right? And these so-called nanoflares, as Parker named them, should happen at some point, and there should be an MHD avalanche kind of energy release powering these coronal loop structures. So then the question is really, what if there are clear observational differences between these two camps, and what are the differences then in the energy deposition? So of course, there are many challenges here. The magnetic connectivity across the solar atmosphere is extremely complex. And anybody that has done 3D MHD modeling will know that actually what defines a coronal loop, the set of field lines that define a coronal loop, actually something extremely ambiguous. The connections are always changing. And therefore, does it really have any sense of talking about the coronal loops at all? Then the problem also is that it's a multi-scale, right? Because of the heating occurring at the very small scales, we have this. If we want to model it properly, we would need to take a huge range from kinetic to MHD scales, right? So then the inhomogeneities across the solar atmosphere, in particular with the density and the magnetic field variation, are major factors that introduce complexities. And then we have all this multi-fluid non-equilibriumization, non-Maxwellian distributions, and so on. So really, there are huge challenges behind this coronal heating problem. So one can think of local signatures of coronal heating, right? So you can take a specific MHD agent, such as transverse MHD waves, and then look for specific signatures that, if you have very high resolution observations, that would really able one to identify the specific agent. Or also on the stress-induced magnetic reconnection side, we could think of, for example, these nanojets that have recently been discovered. But then on the global side, I mean, that's the usual approach. What are the global signatures that each heating mechanism brings into the picture, right? So one here can think of what is the temporal and spatial character of the heating. So for example, whether it's mostly foot point concentrated or uniformly distributed along the loops. What are the effects on the morphology of these bundles? Do we have strands, or is it mostly monolithic, diffused corona? Is the heating are the heating events happening on a high or a low frequency? Are they impulsive or gradual? And then we can also talk about the cooling, right? Because and that is an aspect that is often ignored in coronal heating, because the cooling has also strongly related to how the heating takes place. So the cooling can be localized or global. It can be catastrophic or gradual. And then the question is whether the global response from wave heating would be any different from that of stress-induced reconnection. So let's think about the coronal loop, and let's take just for the sake of argument that we have an in situ coronal heating event somewhere here in the corona. So that leads first to thermalization, right? And it should be accompanied depending on its energy, with a particle acceleration. So then thermal conduction, because of its very high efficiency, acts as a thermostat, and then so that transfers the energy down. So and the radiative losses. So it's really here the transition region acts as an energy dump, setting the balance in the loop, right? So that leads to chromospheric evaporation, and then the loop gets a bit denser. Right, so one can think of a stronger energy release in the corona, so that would lead to stronger conductive flux, stronger radiation, and stronger chromospheric evaporation. But one can also think of an energy event happening low down in the chromosphere, and that would be very different in the sense that it's much more dynamic. Right, it generates, for example, a spicule. Right, and so that you have a very strong change in the transition region in this big radiative losses across a specific height, and then we'll have a thermal conduction really having the job, a more important job in distributing this energy across the corona, but also will be an important enthalpy flux here. So both of these processes will lead to a very dense corona at some point, if the heating is continuous over time. But of course, if it continues over time like this, then the radiation increases, and that will lead to thermal instability and non-equilibrium taking place in the corona. So that forces a limit, a mass limit in the corona, which ultimately evacuates it. So in that sense, there is a limit to the amount of mass that the corona can sustain, or a delicate balance in a way. So what are the global signatures that we're looking for then? The multi-thermal flows, right? So the intensities, Doppler velocities, line broadening. We want to study the time scales and the spatial scales of variation, correlation between quantities at different temperatures. And then we want to be able to answer questions such as, do these global observables vary from region to region? So are there many different heating mechanisms? And do the combination of all these global observables point to a dominant heating mechanism? So one of the main studies or observational factors is the heating variability. So whether it's impulsive, for example, and then one think of first of Parker's nanoflares, and then the holy grail is whether there exists this very hot component from 5 to 10 million K, and whether we can detect it that is unrelated to big flares. However, the models pointed that that both magnetic reconnection and alpha waves should be able to produce this kind of impulsive and very hot temperature component, like very localized temperature component. And even concentrating on one, for example, in the model by Bingert and Peter, that is DC heating, we easily see both steady and bursty heating. So that means that the heating variety is not a very useful factor by itself in order to differ between heating mechanisms. Also, historically, one of the important topics of in coronal heating has been this distribution of the heating over time, and also the distribution in sizes and energies overall. And Hugh Hudson in '91 showed that realized that it's actually because here there are power laws everywhere. It's really the index of this power law that defines whether the bulk of the heating relies on these very small energetic events that we cannot observe. And for that, we would need a power law index steeper than -2. And there have been a huge amount of studies, always conflicting, asking whether this slope is really steeper than 2. And here there are first promising results from Solar Orbiter EUI that suggest that indeed we would be expecting a steeper slope. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Another very important aspect of the in observations is the amount of emission in transition region. So this atmospheric heating really is strongly reflected in the transition region variability and dynamics. And so here, one of the main results is the discovery of this ultrafine scale or unresolved fine structure in the composed of very small loops observed by iris that seem to be powered by magnetic cancellation. So this is from one side. And of course, I mean, by itself, if most of the transition region emission is concentrated here, it doesn't seem to be like connected to the corona. But another important factor behind this emission are the jets, right? So the jets and the transients. And here, of course, there's a much clearer connection to the corona. And here at the top of the list are the spicules. So here there have been a huge amount of studies of spicules that show also that there is an impact in the corona. There is heating going on at the top of the spicules, and therefore the heating already happens or is concentrated at those low heights. And there is a whole zoo of jets here and then bright dots that are linked to very different phenomena in the transition region, such as shocks or clearly reconnection events and so forth. Magnetic field extrapolation studies have shown that a significant fraction of these transition region emission seems to be concentrated in the network, but there is there's a significant fraction as well that is located in inter-network. So another major result are the distribution of upflows and downflows across the spectral lines. And this observation of redshifts in the transition region lines and blue shifts in coronal lines has been a major driver of coronal heating studies, right? And a possible answer has been provided by 3D MHD models that are mostly based on DC heating, so the stress-induced magnetic reconnection, and they have shown that it's really the deposition of the heating in the upper transition region or lower corona that pushes the material down, leading to these redshifts in the transition region, and while they at the same time generate an upflow of hot material, so blue shifts. Also, these 3D MHD models have been very helpful in understanding where what is the most effectively heated region in the solar atmosphere. So this is, for example, a result by Bingert and Peter that shows that on the right-hand side, the heating is concentrated mostly, the heating per unit mass is concentrated in the transition region, right? Then coronal, the non-thermal motions in the solar corona have also been a major field of study. So the studies like McIntosh and Despontieux in 2012 have shown that these non-thermal motions are seem correlated with the Doppler velocities. And this has been classically associated with galvanic waves, although by now I think there's a better understanding that actually there are many different heating models that can explain this trend. But the waves and these observations of from COMP, for example, clearly show that the wave's energy seems to decrease with height, and that there is the power that goes out is much larger than the power that goes back in. So suggesting that something happens with the energy or something happens with the waves. Right. So there's studies like Pant et al. In 2019 have shown that the line of sight effects and wave processes such as mode conversion are the main factors behind this decrease of wave energy, and basically that the wave energy hides in the line width. Testa in 2016 show with combinations of iris observations and eyes in the coronal line of iron 12 that interestingly that there's an increase of non-thermal motions at higher resolution, but that is not really, that does not happen in transition region heights. This suggests that there is also they find a positive correlation with intensities, right? So they suggest that there is a significant energy source in these non-thermal motions that will should ultimately be responsible for or be a direct consequence of coronal heating. Now, the coronal structure is another main field of study. So we know that the corona, when observed in lines such as AIA 171 or 193, that it appears filamentary. Right? So we talk about strands. And however, if we go at higher temperatures, it appears fuzzy. And that suggests that the different mechanisms that are at play here. A big puzzle has been also the lifetimes of these coronal loops, observed, for example, with trace and AIA, so much longer than the radiative cooling time, which also combined with these differential emission measure calculations, which are broad, suggest that this coronal loop bundles should be composed of strands that are independently heated. And therefore, these unresolved strands have been a major topic of study, and HIC has provided a big result here, and that really indicating that there is indeed there are strands of these loops on the order of 500 kilometers or less, and that actually there seem to be more, and they're thinner at a low emission. This filamentary structure also should be discussed in the context of cooling as well. So because there has been studies like Viale and Klimchuk in 2012 that showed that there's widespread cooling, right? So that we're observing most of the time is the effect of cooling. So the heating happens in very small temporal scales. And therefore, what we really see everywhere is cooling. Also, these loops appear to be overdense compared to the RTB scaling law. Of course, that depends from region to region, and that has led a huge array of modeling trying to explain these long lifetimes, broad DMs, overdense loops, slow cooling, and so forth. So, but the problem here is that most of them, there's a big challenge in producing 3D MHD models of this of the processes, right? So, and of course, there's no self-consistent approach so far. So this, what other signatures of cooling do we have? So the observations with Sumer and with Hinode, they have shown that this coronal variability is especially strong in the EUV in active regions, right? So there seems to be stronger variability for lower temperatures, right? And a subject entities that are particularly noteworthy for this kind of variability are plumes above sunspots. and this variability seems to be linked with downflows across chronospheric and transition region lines, with a very wide velocity distribution from subsonic to supersonic downflows. And therefore, many possibilities have been proposed, from draining of rising emerging loops to siphon flows or to coronal rain.
5 minutes left, Patrick.
Okay. So these downflows are clearly linked to coronal structures. Studies such as Klein et al., Chad, or Tian et al., and Strauss et al. Have shown that that they can be very variable depending on the wavelengths in which they are observed, and they can be very long-lived, actually. For example, Chita et al. In 2016 have shown that these flows and the time scale to completely drain a loop would be on the order of 100 seconds to 1,000 seconds for the densities that are observed. However, these downflows exist on the order of or tens of minutes or more. So it's quite a puzzle, and this has favored the siphon flow for this particular the siphon flow explanation for this particular feature. Samant et al. And Nelson et al. Have also done major statistical studies. Samant et al. In particular have shown that that 80% of the rasters above sunspots with iris have show this presence of supersonic downflows, and about half of them have this chronospheric counterpart. With slightly higher Doppler shifts for those that have a chronospheric counterpart. Interestingly, the widths of the structure that show these downflows are very similar to the widths in high C of the strands that are observed in high C. So that links, of course, to coronal rain, and whether this could be explained by coronal rain. So coronal rain is this cool and dense partially ionized plasma. Seems to be ubiquitous above active regions. It has a very dynamic and multi-thermal, and when observed at this high resolution observations with the SST, for example, it shows a very similar width as the loops that are now observed with high C. So importantly, this coronal rain is not different from a siphon flow. It can be a siphon flow, so there is no contradiction there. And but the important question here is whether how much really coronal rain is there? Is there any link to the coronal variability and the filamentary structure? Now, just a side note on the flare-driven rain, we observe very similar dynamics, but the same kind of widths. So the same kind of widths are observed in the rain compared to the ribbon, suggesting that this could be the true spatial scale of energy transport mechanism across the multiple energetic scales. So it would seem that the more you heat, the more it cools and rains. But so this is, of course, a big question. Then another major discovery has been this long period intensity pulsations, which I like to think about them like a magnetic circadian clocks defined by the magnetic field. So here, studies by O'Shea et al. 2014 or Homo et al. 2015 have really led the field in a massive new area of research, showing that these pulsations are everywhere, and they really pose a big problem on trying to understand them, because they are like clocks. How can regions like this exist in the solar atmosphere, given its complexity, given its stochasticity, and maintain the same heating profile over days? Because we know that thermal molecularity is probably the most is the leading explanation behind these UV pulsations. So these are my conclusions. We have a set of a list of observational constraints behind this chromosphere-corona mass and energy circulation that is regulated by the magnetic field. We see parallels everywhere, with hints that the indexes may be quite steep, so suggesting that indeed, and as expected, the energy should be released at very small scales. The atmospheric heating is strongly reflected in this transition region variability and dynamics. So, for example, the ultra unresolved fine structure, jets and transients, and also showing that the transition region is really the most efficiently heated region in the solar atmosphere. We have these upflows in coronal lines, downflows in transition region lines, the existence of non-thermal motions in corona that hide this significant energy source, the puzzle of the coronal loop morphology, why is it stranded at transition region temperatures but fuzzier at the higher temperatures, the long lifetimes of loops and the widespread cooling. And then we have this coronal rain that seems to be ubiquitous with the long period UV pulsations. So this existence this points to a delicate coronal mass limit balance. So if you heat it too much, then there will be drastic cooling and evacuation. And the numerical prospects for achieving that, the main challenges are achieving self-consistent 3D MHD models that are high resolution enough that are able to produce the correct coronal densities, right? We know that these models are able to reproduce the broad DMs, but there is not enough emission yet, and that may be because the spicules aspect, this dynamic aspect, is still missing. And then on the AC heating side, of course, we do not have the global subconsistent MHD simulations yet, so we are not able to clearly mention what are the global observational signatures of AC heating yet. And that's because the dissipation mechanisms need very high resolution by themselves. So that's a major challenge. So that's all. I'll leave it there. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent talk, Patrick. Thank you so much for setting the scene and managing to put all this impressive amount of material into one great presentation. Thank you so much again. We have a few questions for you, but I guess we will actually relay some of them later to you on the discussion session. Just one briefly. The first question that was asked by Somaye Sabri. Thanks for the nice talk. You talk about the Alphen wave effect on heating. Does it mean that Alphen waves have a dominant effect on heating than magnetosonic waves?
Yes. So there has been many studies that suggest that really the Alphen wave, the transverse MHD wave, is able to carry much more energy because it's magnetic, right? Really much more magnetic than sonic. It's able to carry much more energy across the solar atmosphere, and in particular into the corona, right? So they do not steep into shocks in the lower atmosphere, for example, so they do not lose their energy there as magnetosonic waves do. But on the other hand, of course, there is the problem of dissipation of this wave. How do they dissipate in the corona? So that's one of the big problems there.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you again. We'll continue now with the research talks. The first speaker is Tim Bastian.